The winter of 1942 brought more than just snow to the Eastern Front. It brought death, delivered silently through the scope of a rifle held by a woman who would become a legend. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, though the enemy soldiers had begun calling her something else entirely. They called her Lady Death, and for good reason. Before the war, Lyudmila was just an ordinary university student studying history in Kiev. She had dreams like any other young woman, plans for her future, ambitions to become a teacher. But when the Nazi forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, everything changed. The peaceful life she knew vanished overnight, replaced by the harsh reality of survival and resistance. Lyudmila made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She volunteered for the Red Army, determined to fight for her homeland. The recruiting officers laughed when she told them she wanted to be a sniper. A woman in combat? With a rifle? It seemed absurd to them. But Lyudmila was not someone who accepted rejection easily. She had been practicing shooting since she was young, a hobby that had turned into a serious skill over the years. To prove herself, she took their challenge. They gave her a rifle and pointed to a distant target. Without hesitation, without nervousness, she raised the weapon, aimed, and fired. The bullet struck exactly where she intended. Then she did it again, and again. The smiles disappeared from the officers' faces. They realized they were looking at someone extraordinary. Within weeks, Lyudmila found herself on the front lines near Odessa. The reality of war hit her like a physical blow. The sounds, the smells, the constant fear that gripped everyone around her. But she had made her choice, and she would not turn back. Her first mission as a sniper came sooner than expected. 2 Romanian soldiers were spotted advancing toward Soviet positions. She was ordered to stop them. Lyudmila took position behind a ruined wall, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. Through her scope, she could see the enemy soldiers clearly. They were just men like any others, probably with families waiting for them somewhere. For a moment, she hesitated. Taking a life was not something anyone could prepare for, no matter how much they trained. But then she remembered why she was there. These invaders had come to destroy her country, to kill her people. She steadied her breathing and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the battlefield. 1 soldier fell. The second one panicked, looking around frantically for the source of the shot. He never found it. Lyudmila's second bullet found him before he could take cover. In those few seconds, she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer a student or a civilian. She was a soldier, a sniper, a weapon of war. News of her accuracy spread quickly through the ranks. Other soldiers began to respect her, though some still questioned whether a woman belonged in combat. Lyudmila let her rifle do the talking. Day after day, she took positions in the most dangerous areas, often spending hours completely still, waiting for the perfect shot. Her patience was legendary. While other soldiers grew restless, she remained calm, focused, deadly. The autumn fighting around Odessa was brutal. The city was under constant siege and casualties mounted on both sides. Lyudmila moved through the ruins like a ghost, taking up positions in destroyed buildings, in crater holes, behind rubble piles. She learned to read the battlefield like a book, understanding where enemies would likely appear, predicting their movements, anticipating their mistakes. Each successful shot added to her growing reputation. By the time Odessa fell and the Soviet forces had to evacuate, Lyudmila had already eliminated over 100 enemy soldiers. But she felt no pride in these numbers. Each one represented a life taken, a decision made in the split second between mercy and necessity. The war was changing her, hardening her, turning her into something she had never imagined becoming. The evacuation took her to Sevastopol, where the fighting was even more intense. This city would become the place where her legend truly began. The Germans were desperate to capture this strategic port, throwing wave after wave of soldiers against the Soviet defenders. Lyudmila found herself in constant action, barely getting any rest between missions. It was during the Sevastopol campaign that the enemy first became truly aware of her. German commanders started receiving reports of a deadly sniper, eliminating their men with frightening precision. They noticed patterns in the attacks, always from different positions, always perfectly timed, always lethal. They began to realize they were dealing with someone exceptional. The German army decided to respond to this threat in a way that was both an insult and a compliment. They placed a bounty on her head. The amount was staggering, enough to make any soldier wealthy for life. Leaflets were dropped over Soviet positions, offering rewards for anyone who could kill or capture the female sniper. The Germans even tried psychological warfare, using loudspeakers to taunt her, promising her safety if she surrendered, threatening terrible consequences if she continued fighting. Lyudmila's response was simple and direct. She ignored their threats and continued her work with even greater determination. If anything, the bounty made her more careful, more calculated in her approach. She knew that now she was not just fighting enemy soldiers but also bounty hunters, soldiers motivated by greed rather than duty. This made them more dangerous, more unpredictable. Her fellow soldiers worried about her. The bounty had painted a target on her back that glowed brighter with each passing day. They urged her to be careful, to perhaps take a step back from the front lines. But Lyudmila refused. She understood something that many did not. The bounty was not just about her anymore. It was about what she represented. She was proof that women could fight, could be effective soldiers, could strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. To back down now would be to betray not just herself, but every woman who might follow in her footsteps. The winter deepened, and so did the battle for Sevastopol. Lyudmila continued her deadly work, her count rising steadily. But she knew that the bounty would attract attention, would bring hunters who were skilled, patient, and determined. The Germans would send their best snipers to face her, men who had killed dozens themselves, experts in the brutal art of sniper warfare. The war had become personal now. It was no longer just about defending her country. It was about survival, about proving that she could not be intimidated, could not be stopped. The Germans had made a mistake by placing that bounty on her head. They thought it would make her afraid, make her retreat. Instead, it had only made her more dangerous, more focused, more determined to show them exactly what kind of enemy they had created. The German high command was not accustomed to being embarrassed. When reports continued to flood in about their soldiers falling to an unseen enemy, when the bounty failed to produce results, they decided to take more serious action. They would send not just any soldiers, but their elite snipers, men who had terrorized Allied forces across multiple fronts. These were hunters who had perfected their craft through years of warfare. The first of these elite hunters arrived in Sevastopol in early December. His name was never recorded in Soviet documents, but survivors remembered him as the Bavarian. He was a tall man with cold blue eyes, known for having eliminated over 50 Allied soldiers in various campaigns. The German command gave him one specific mission: find the female sniper and eliminate her. The bounty would be his reward. The Bavarian studied the battlefield carefully. He reviewed reports of every attack attributed to the female sniper, looking for patterns, habits, anything that might give him an advantage. He was methodical, patient, understanding that rushing would only get him killed. He noticed that she favored ruins with multiple exit points, that she never used the same position twice in a row, that she seemed to strike during moments of maximum chaos, when other battles distracted attention. Lyudmila, for her part, had been warned about the arrival of enemy snipers specifically hunting for her. Her commanders offered to pull her back, to give her safer assignments away from the front lines. She refused. Running away was not in her nature, and besides, she understood the larger picture. If she retreated, it would be seen as a victory for the enemy, proof that their tactics worked, that they could intimidate Soviet forces. She would not give them that satisfaction. The cat and mouse game began in earnest. For 3 days, both snipers searched for each other across the ruins of Sevastopol. Lyudmila changed her tactics, becoming even more unpredictable than before. She took shots from positions that seemed impossible, angles that no reasonable sniper would attempt. She moved constantly, never staying in one location for more than a single shot if possible. The Bavarian grew frustrated. This female sniper was unlike any enemy he had faced before. She seemed to anticipate his moves, to understand how he thought. Several times he believed he had located her position, only to realize he was looking at a decoy, a carefully arranged dummy designed to draw his fire and reveal his location. She was playing the same game he was, but playing it better. On the 4th day, their duel reached its climax. Lyudmila had taken position in a partially collapsed apartment building. She had been there for hours, perfectly still, watching enemy movements through a small gap in the rubble. She knew the hunter was out there somewhere, searching for her. But she also knew that patience was her greatest weapon. Whoever moved first would likely die. Then she saw it. A reflection, barely visible, coming from a destroyed church tower about 400 meters away. It was just a brief flash, the kind of thing most people would miss. But Lyudmila had trained herself to notice such details. Someone was in that tower. Someone with optical equipment. Someone who was very good at hiding but had made one tiny mistake. She did not move. Not yet. If she had spotted the enemy sniper, there was a chance he had spotted her too. This could be a trap, a way to draw her fire so he could pinpoint her exact location. She needed to be certain. Minutes passed like hours as she watched that tower, looking for any other sign of movement, any confirmation that her enemy was there. Then she saw it again. This time it was not a reflection but movement. The slightest shift of shadows in the tower window. The Bavarian was repositioning himself, probably trying to get a better angle on Soviet positions. He still had not located her specifically. This was her chance. Lyudmila made her calculations instantly. Distance, wind speed, the angle of the shot. She adjusted her rifle by millimeters. Her breathing slowed to almost nothing. The moment had to be perfect. There would be no second chance. If she missed, he would know exactly where she was, and he was too skilled to miss his return shot. She squeezed the trigger smoothly, without jerking, without hesitation. The bullet flew across the battlefield, invisible, silent until impact. Through her scope, she saw the figure in the tower jerk backward and disappear from view. She had hit him, but she could not be sure if it was fatal. Either way, the Bavarian would not be hunting anyone for a while. Lyudmila did not celebrate. She immediately left her position, moving quickly through the ruins to a predetermined safe location. Victory meant nothing if you were not alive to report it. Only later, when scouts confirmed finding the body of a German sniper in that tower, did she allow herself a moment of satisfaction. The first hunter sent to kill her had failed, but the Germans were not finished. If one elite sniper could not defeat her, they would send more. Within days, 2 more arrived in Sevastopol. These men were even more experienced, veterans of countless battles. They worked as a team, something Lyudmila had not faced before. One would act as a spotter while the other took the shot. Then they would switch roles, making them twice as effective. The pressure intensified. Lyudmila found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, checking and rechecking her surroundings. Sleep became difficult. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. Every sound could be a threat. Her fellow soldiers noticed the strain, saw how the constant threat was affecting her. But she refused to show weakness, refused to admit that the endless hunt was taking its toll. The partnership of the 2 German snipers proved formidable. They eliminated several Soviet soldiers in quick succession, always from well-concealed positions, always escaping before anyone could locate them. They were sending a message. The female sniper was not the only deadly hunter on this battlefield. Lyudmila studied their patterns just as they studied hers. She realized they were trying to draw her out, using their attacks to provoke a response that would reveal her location. It was a smart strategy, playing on her sense of duty to protect her fellow soldiers. They were trying to use her own strengths against her. She decided to turn the trap around. If they wanted to draw her out, she would let them think they had succeeded. She began leaving false trails, creating evidence of her presence in certain areas while actually being somewhere completely different. She used dummies, arranged positions to look occupied, even fired shots from locations she planned to abandon immediately. The 2 German snipers took the bait. They focused their attention on the areas where they believed she was operating, setting up their own ambush. What they did not know was that Lyudmila had already identified their general location and was working her way toward them from an unexpected angle. The confrontation came on a gray morning when fog covered much of the battlefield. Visibility was poor, which most snipers would consider unfavorable conditions. But Lyudmila had learned to use every situation to her advantage. She moved through the fog like a spirit, using the reduced visibility as cover, getting closer to the enemy position than any sniper normally would dare. She found them in a bombed-out factory, positioned on the 2nd floor with excellent views of the surrounding area. They were good, very good, but they had made one mistake. They assumed she would attack from a distance, from another concealed position hundreds of meters away. They never expected her to get close, to take a shot from less than 100 meters away. Lyudmila took her position behind a pile of rubble, her rifle steady despite the cold that numbed her fingers. Through the fog, she could barely make out their silhouettes. One was looking through binoculars, scanning the distance. The other was eating something, probably thinking they had time before any action would occur. She aimed carefully. At this distance, in these conditions, she had to be perfect. Her first shot took the spotter in the chest. Before his partner could even react, before he could raise his own rifle, her second shot found him too. Both men fell. Their hunt ended. Their partnership dissolved in an instant. Lyudmila retreated immediately, knowing that the shots would draw attention. As she disappeared into the fog, she felt no triumph, no excitement. Just exhaustion and the grim satisfaction of survival. 3 elite German snipers had come to kill her. 3 had failed, but she knew there would be more. The bounty still stood and the war was far from over. The elimination of 3 elite German snipers sent shockwaves through enemy ranks. What had started as a mission to remove a troublesome Soviet soldier had turned into a matter of pride and reputation. The German command could not allow one woman to humiliate their finest hunters. They increased the bounty even further, making it one of the highest rewards offered for any single soldier on the Eastern Front. But something else was happening. Lyudmila's fame was spreading beyond the battlefield. Soviet newspapers had picked up her story, turning her into a symbol of resistance. Radio broadcasts spoke of her victories, each one embellished slightly to boost morale among Soviet forces and civilians alike. She became more than a soldier. She became a legend, an icon that represented the strength and determination of the Soviet people. The attention made Lyudmila uncomfortable. She had never sought fame or recognition. She was simply doing what she believed was necessary to defend her homeland. The stories made her seem superhuman, invincible, but she knew the truth. She was just a woman with a rifle, trying to survive each day, living with the weight of every life she had taken. Her commanders saw opportunity in her growing reputation. During a strategic meeting in late December, a bold plan was proposed. If Lyudmila could eliminate enemy snipers with such efficiency, why not aim higher? Why not target enemy officers, specifically the generals who commanded entire divisions? Such assassinations could disrupt German operations, create confusion in their command structure, and deliver a devastating blow to enemy morale. The idea was controversial. Targeting generals required getting much closer to enemy headquarters, navigating through heavy security, taking shots that would immediately trigger massive retaliation. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward was equally significant. One well-placed bullet could save hundreds or even thousands of Soviet lives by disrupting enemy plans and operations. Lyudmila listened to the proposal carefully. She understood both the military logic and the political motivation behind it. Success would be a propaganda victory as much as a tactical one. But she also understood something else. This mission was different from hunting snipers or stopping advancing soldiers. This was assassination, targeting specific individuals in a calculated manner. It crossed a line that made even seasoned soldiers uncomfortable. After hours of discussion, she agreed. Not because of propaganda value or political pressure, but because she believed it could genuinely help end the war faster. If disrupting their command structure could save Soviet lives, then she would do it. The decision was made not from hatred or vengeance, but from cold, practical calculation. Intelligence officers provided her with information about German positions and command structures around Sevastopol. They identified 3 generals who were particularly important to enemy operations. General Klaus von Becker commanded armored divisions that had been devastating Soviet defensive lines. General Heinrich Steiner oversaw artillery operations that had destroyed entire neighborhoods. General Otto Richter coordinated infantry attacks that had cost thousands of Soviet lives. Each general had different security arrangements, different habits, different vulnerabilities. Lyudmila studied the intelligence reports for days, memorizing every detail, looking for opportunities, planning approaches and escape routes. This was not the reactive combat she was used to. This was planned, premeditated, requiring patience and perfect execution. The first opportunity came in early January 1943. General von Becker was scheduled to visit forward positions to inspect his tank units. Intelligence suggested he would arrive in the early morning, staying for approximately 2 hours before returning to his headquarters. The visit would bring him within range, though barely. requiring a shot of nearly 800 meters in winter conditions. Lyudmila positioned herself the night before, finding a location in the ruins of an old textile factory that provided both clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. She spent the freezing night completely motionless, conserving energy, preparing mentally for what was to come. As dawn broke, she saw movement in the German positions. Vehicles arrived, soldiers formed up in neat lines. The general was coming. Through her scope, she watched von Becker emerge from his staff car. He was a large man, confident in his movements, surrounded by a dozen officers and guards. He inspected troops, pointed at various positions, clearly comfortable being so close to the front lines. His confidence would be his downfall. The shot was extremely difficult. The distance was at the very limit of her rifle's effective range. Wind conditions were unpredictable, shifting constantly. The target was surrounded by people moving frequently, never still for more than a few seconds. Lyudmila waited, controlling her breathing, ignoring the cold that had numbed her entire body. She needed the perfect moment, that one instant when everything aligned. It came when von Becker stopped to examine a map one of his officers had spread on the hood of a vehicle. For perhaps 5 seconds he was relatively still, focused on the map, his body positioned in a way that gave her a clear target. Lyudmila made her calculations in an instant, adjusted for wind and distance, and took the shot. The bullet traveled for what seemed like an eternity before finding its target. Through her scope, she saw von Becker suddenly stumble, his hand going to his chest. He fell backward into the arms of his shocked officers. Chaos erupted in the German position. Soldiers scattered, looking for threats, not understanding where the shot had come from. Lyudmila was already moving, abandoning her position even before confirming the kill. She had planned 3 different escape routes and now used them all, moving through the ruins in a zigzag pattern, never staying exposed for more than a few seconds. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of German soldiers searching frantically, firing randomly at suspected sniper positions. But she was already gone, disappearing into the maze of destroyed buildings. Confirmation of the general's death came hours later through Soviet intelligence networks. Von Becker had died within minutes of being hit, despite the desperate efforts of his medical staff. The German command was in shock. Generals were supposed to be safe, protected by layers of security and distance from the front lines. The fact that one had been killed by a sniper seemed almost impossible. Soviet leadership was ecstatic. The propaganda value was immense. News of the assassination spread rapidly through Soviet forces, boosting morale enormously. Soldiers who had been exhausted and demoralized found new energy, new hope. If their enemies' generals could be reached, then perhaps victory was possible after all. But Lyudmila felt no celebration. She had killed a man regardless of his rank or the uniform he wore. She understood the military value of what she had done, but she also understood that she had crossed into territory that felt different from battlefield combat. This was targeted assassination, and it changed something inside her, added another weight to the burden she already carried. The Germans responded with fury and fear. If one general could be killed, others were vulnerable too. Security was immediately tightened around all high-ranking officers. Movement patterns were changed, visits to forward areas were reduced or canceled entirely. The entire command structure became more cautious, more paranoid. This was exactly what Soviet commanders had hoped for. By creating fear among German leadership, they forced the enemy to become more defensive, less aggressive, less willing to take risks. The psychological impact of the assassination was proving to be as valuable as the tactical benefit. But the mission was not complete. 2 more generals remained on the target list, and Lyudmila had agreed to eliminate all 3 if possible. The question was whether she could strike again before the Germans adapted fully to this new threat. The element of surprise was gone now. Every German officer would be watching for snipers, taking precautions, avoiding exposure. Lyudmila knew that the next attempts would be even more dangerous than the first. The enemy would be prepared, alert, suspicious of every position that could hide a sniper. She would need to be smarter, more creative, willing to take risks that bordered on suicidal. The bounty on her head had probably increased again, and now she was not just fighting soldiers and snipers, but an entire army determined to prevent another assassination. She spent days studying intelligence reports on the remaining 2 generals, looking for weaknesses, opportunities, any chance to complete her mission. General Steiner was particularly cautious, rarely leaving his headquarters, surrounding himself with heavy security whenever he did move. General Richter was more active but had become unpredictable in his movements, probably on purpose, making it nearly impossible to anticipate where he would be. The challenge seemed almost impossible. But Lyudmila had built her reputation on doing the impossible. She had survived when everyone expected her to fail, had defeated enemies who were supposed to be superior, had struck targets that should have been beyond reach. She would find a way or she would die trying. The war had made her into something she never expected to become. Not just a soldier or a sniper, but an assassin whose actions could influence the course of battles and change the calculations of generals on both sides. General Heinrich Steiner was known among his troops as the Hammer because of his relentless artillery tactics. He believed in overwhelming firepower, in reducing enemy positions to rubble before sending in infantry. His methods had destroyed entire districts of Sevastopol, killed countless civilians and soldiers alike. He was also known for his caution, perhaps understanding that his brutal efficiency made him a priority target. Intelligence reports on Steiner's movements were frustratingly sparse. He conducted most of his command operations from a heavily fortified bunker, several kilometers behind the front lines. When he did emerge, it was always surrounded by a security detail that seemed excessive even by German standards. The man understood that he was valuable and vulnerable, and he took no chances. Lyudmila spent 2 weeks tracking his patterns, studying every scrap of information Soviet intelligence could gather. She learned that Steiner had a routine, despite his attempts at unpredictability. Every 3 days he visited a specific artillery position to personally oversee firing operations. He believed that his presence motivated the crews, improved their accuracy, made them more effective. It was perhaps his only consistent vulnerability. The artillery position was well protected, surrounded by infantry, with multiple machine gun nests covering all approaches. Getting close enough for a shot seemed impossible. The nearest position that offered any kind of sightline was over 700 meters away, across open ground that was constantly patrolled. Any sniper who attempted an approach would likely be spotted and killed before getting into position. Lyudmila studied the terrain for days, looking at maps, observing through binoculars from safe positions, trying to find an angle that everyone else had missed. Then she noticed something interesting. There was an old sewer system that ran beneath the area, part of the city's infrastructure that had survived the bombing. The tunnels were partially collapsed in places, probably flooded in others, and certainly dangerous. But they might provide a way to get closer without being detected. She proposed the plan to her commanders. They were skeptical, concerned about the risks. The sewers could collapse at any moment, could be booby-trapped, could simply be impassable. If she got stuck underground, there would be no way to rescue her. She would die alone in the darkness, and her body would never be recovered. But Lyudmila insisted. This might be the only opportunity to reach Steiner. His artillery operations were devastating Soviet defenses, killing dozens of soldiers every day. Eliminating him could save countless lives. After hours of debate, her commanders reluctantly agreed, though they made clear this was her decision, her risk to take. She entered the sewers on a moonless night, guided by an engineer who knew the old city infrastructure. The tunnels were worse than she had imagined. Water dripped constantly from cracked ceilings, the smell was overwhelming, and rats scattered at her approach. The engineer led her through a maze of passages, pointing out areas where the ceiling looked unstable, places where flooding had created deep pools that had to be waded through carefully. After 2 hours of careful navigation, they reached a point the engineer believed was near the artillery position. There was a drainage grate above them, probably designed for rainwater overflow. Lyudmila climbed up carefully, looking through the grate to get her bearings. She was closer than expected, perhaps 400 meters from the artillery position, hidden in a depression that enemy patrols had apparently overlooked. The engineer left her there with whispered wishes of good luck. She was now alone underground, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. She had brought enough water and food for 3 days. If Steiner did not appear in that time, she would have to retreat through the sewers and consider the mission a failure. The first day passed with no sign of the general. Lyudmila remained in the drainage tunnel, occasionally looking through the grate to observe enemy movements. The second day was the same. By the third day, she was beginning to think the mission was doomed. Perhaps intelligence about Steiner's routine had been wrong, or perhaps he had changed his schedule, sensing the danger. Then, on the morning of the fourth day, she heard unusual activity above ground. Vehicles were arriving. Soldiers were forming up with unusual precision. Something important was happening. She looked through the grate and saw staff cars pulling up to the artillery position. Officers emerged, but she could not identify them from her limited angle. Making a decision that could save her life or end it, Lyudmila quietly pushed the grate aside and emerged from the drainage tunnel. She was now exposed in enemy territory with no quick escape route. If anyone looked in her direction, she would be seen immediately. But she needed a better angle to identify targets and take a shot. She crawled to a small rise in the ground, created by bombing rubble, that offered minimal cover but a better view. Through her scope, she could now see the artillery position clearly. And there, inspecting a massive artillery piece, was General Steiner himself, easily identified by his distinctive uniform and the deference shown by everyone around him. He was surrounded by officers and guards, never standing still, constantly moving from one gun position to another. Taking a shot would be incredibly difficult. The distance was manageable, but the target would not cooperate by staying still. She would have to time it perfectly, take the shot during one of his brief pauses. Lyudmila settled into position, controlling her breathing, ignoring the danger of her exposed location. She watched Steiner move through the artillery position, observing his pattern, learning his rhythm. He would stop at each gun, ask questions, examine equipment, then move to the next. Each stop lasted about 30 seconds. That would be her window. She chose the third gun in the line, calculated where he would likely stand based on his previous stops, and prepared herself. When Steiner reached that position, she would have one shot before chaos erupted and security forces converged on her location. One shot to change the course of artillery operations that had killed so many. Steiner moved to the second gun, then began walking toward the third. Lyudmila tracked him through her scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. He reached the gun and stopped, turning to face one of his officers who was explaining something about the weapon's performance. For a moment he was perfectly positioned, his profile clear in her crosshairs. She took the shot without hesitation, without thought. The bullet crossed the distance in less than a second, striking Steiner in the head. He dropped instantly, dead before his body hit the ground. The German soldiers around him stood frozen for a heartbeat, unable to process what had just happened. Then pandemonium erupted. Lyudmila was already moving, sliding back toward the drainage tunnel as bullets began impacting around her. German soldiers had spotted the general direction of the shot and were firing frantically. Machine guns opened up, tearing apart the rubble where she had been lying moments before. She dropped into the tunnel, pulled the grate closed above her, and ran through the darkness as fast as she dared. Behind her, she could hear Germans discovering the drainage system, shouting orders, beginning to pursue, but they did not know the tunnels like her engineer guide had. They were fumbling in darkness while she moved with purpose, following the route she had memorized. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she reached a section where the tunnel had partially collapsed, creating a barrier that would slow any pursuit. She emerged from the sewers far from the artillery position, exhausted, soaked, filthy, but alive. Soviet soldiers who had been watching for her return rushed forward to help her back to their lines. News of the assassination had already reached them through radio intercepts of panicked German communications. Another general had fallen to the female sniper. The impossible had been accomplished again. The impact of Steiner's death was immediate and dramatic. German artillery operations became noticeably less coordinated in the following days. Without their commanders' aggressive tactics and personal oversight, crews became more cautious, less effective. Soviet forces gained breathing room, time to reinforce positions, opportunities to launch counterattacks that had previously been impossible under constant artillery bombardment. But the cost of the mission had been severe. Lyudmila was physically and mentally exhausted, pushed beyond normal human limits. Her commanders insisted she take time to recover, but she refused. There was still one more general on the list, one more target to eliminate. General Otto Richter, the infantry commander, remained alive and dangerous. The German response to Steiner's assassination was even more extreme than after von Becker's death. Security around all senior officers was tripled. Movement patterns became almost random, making prediction nearly impossible. New orders were issued that all generals must wear standard uniforms without rank insignia when near the front lines, making identification difficult even for skilled observers. Lyudmila knew that eliminating Richter would be the hardest challenge yet. The Germans had learned from the previous assassinations, had adapted their security procedures, had become paranoid about snipers. Every possible sniper position was now being watched. Every suspicious location was being investigated. The element of surprise that had made the first two missions possible was completely gone. Soviet intelligence worked frantically too. The location chosen for the medal ceremony was several kilometers behind German lines, in a partially intact building that had once been a cultural center. Intelligence suggested approximately 200 German soldiers would attend, including officers, guards, and the medal recipients themselves. General Richter would be the centerpiece, presenting the awards personally, a morale event designed to boost the spirits of troops who had been suffering heavy casualties. Reaching the location seemed impossible through conventional means. Any approach would require crossing heavily patrolled enemy territory, avoiding multiple checkpoints, and somehow getting within range without being detected. Soviet commanders studied maps and aerial reconnaissance photos, trying to find a solution, but every route seemed suicidal. Lyudmila examined the intelligence reports differently. She was not looking for a safe route or a perfect plan. She was looking for any route, any possibility regardless of danger, and she found something that others had dismissed as too risky to consider. There was a drainage canal that ran through the area, used for industrial waste before the war. It passed within 300 meters of the cultural center before emptying into the bay. The canal was partially filled with debris and contaminated water, considered impassable by conventional military thinking. But Lyudmila had already proven that she could use underground passages that others ignored. If she could reach the canal from Soviet lines and follow it to the ceremony location, she might have a chance. The plan she proposed was met with strong resistance from her commanders. The previous sewer infiltration had been dangerous enough, but at least it had been through relatively stable tunnels with a guide who knew the system. This canal was completely unknown, potentially blocked in multiple places, possibly monitored by German patrols who understood its strategic value. But Lyudmila insisted with an intensity that surprised everyone. 2 generals had been eliminated. Completing the mission by taking out the third was no longer just about military strategy. It had become personal, a test of her own abilities, a way to prove that the impossible could be achieved through determination and skill. Her commanders finally agreed, though they made clear they considered it a suicide mission. She entered the canal system alone on the night before the ceremony, carrying minimal equipment to move faster. The canal was worse than anticipated. Old industrial waste had created a toxic environment. The smell was overwhelming and the water level varied from ankle-deep to chest-deep in different sections. Several times she encountered blockages that required careful climbing over rubble, while trying not to disturb anything that might collapse or make noise. Progress was agonizingly slow. She had estimated the journey would take 3 hours, but after 5 hours she was less than halfway to her destination. Fatigue was setting in. The toxic environment was affecting her breathing, and she was beginning to doubt whether she could reach the location in time for the ceremony. Then she encountered a section where the canal ceiling had partially collapsed, creating a barrier that seemed impassable. She could not go over it without emerging above ground into enemy territory. She could not go around it. The only option was to go through it, to squeeze through gaps in the rubble that might collapse at any moment in darkness, while contaminated water flowed around her. Lyudmila made the decision without hesitation. She had come too far to turn back now. Carefully, inch by inch, she worked her way through the collapsed section, feeling for handholds, testing each movement before committing her weight. Once, a piece of rubble shifted beneath her hand, and for a terrifying moment she thought the entire section would collapse on top of her. But it held, and she continued forward. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, she emerged on the other side of the collapse. She was bruised, exhausted, filthy beyond description, but still moving. The remaining distance took another 3 hours. But finally she reached a point where daylight filtered down through a drainage grate above her head. Looking up through the grate, she could see the cultural center building about 250 meters away. Soldiers were already gathering, setting up for the ceremony. She had made it, though just barely. Her entire body ached. Her lungs burned from breathing toxic fumes, and her hands were cut from climbing over sharp rubble. But she had her rifle, she had ammunition, and she had a clear line of sight to where the ceremony would take place. She could not emerge from the canal during daylight without being immediately spotted. She would have to take the shot from the drainage tunnel through the grate, under conditions that were far from ideal. The angle was awkward, forcing her to brace herself uncomfortably against the tunnel walls. The grate itself would potentially deflect the bullet, requiring her to calculate trajectory through the metal bars. And she would have only one shot before enemy forces located her position and either killed her or trapped her in the canal. Hours passed as she waited, conserving energy, preparing mentally for what was to come. She could hear activity above ground, voices in German, vehicles arriving, the sounds of soldiers assembling. The ceremony was beginning. Through the grate she could see officers taking their positions, soldiers lining up in formation, medals being prepared for presentation. Then she saw him, General Otto Richter, unmistakable despite wearing a uniform without obvious rank insignia. He carried himself with authority, his posture and bearing marking him as a senior officer even without decorations. He moved to a small platform that had been set up for the ceremony, preparing to address the assembled soldiers. Lyudmila positioned herself as best she could in the cramped tunnel, bracing her rifle against the wall, calculating the trajectory through the grate bars. The shot would have to be perfect. Any deviation caused by the grate would send the bullet wide of the target. The distance was manageable, but the angle was terrible, forcing her to shoot at an upward slant that increased the difficulty significantly. Richter began speaking, his voice carrying across the assembly. Lyudmila could not understand the words, but she could hear the tone, the confidence, the authority. This was a man who believed himself safe, protected by distance and security, never imagining that an enemy sniper was lying in toxic water beneath his feet, preparing to end his life. She waited for him to pause in his speech, to stand still for just a moment. The opportunity came when he began pinning medals on soldiers who stood at attention before him. For those few seconds, he was focused on the task, not moving, presenting a stable target. Lyudmila took a breath, released it halfway, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet passed through the grate bars, its trajectory slightly altered but still true enough. It struck Richter in the upper chest, a wound that might not be immediately fatal but would certainly be devastating. She saw him stagger backward, surprise and pain crossing his face before guards rushed forward and he disappeared from her view. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Soldiers scattered, looking for threats, firing in all directions. Machine guns opened up on suspected sniper positions. Within seconds, someone spotted the drainage grate and realized where the shot had originated. Bullets began impacting around and through the grate, ricocheting off the tunnel walls. Lyudmila was already moving, crawling back through the canal as fast as possible. Behind her, she could hear Germans descending into the drainage system, pursuing her through the toxic water. But she had a head start, and she knew they would be cautious, expecting traps, uncertain of the tunnel layout. She reached the collapsed section that had nearly stopped her earlier. Exhaustion had made her clumsy, and as she climbed through, her foot dislodged a key piece of rubble. The entire section began collapsing behind her, tons of debris falling into the canal, creating an impassable barrier that would stop any pursuit but also nearly killed her as she frantically scrambled clear. The rest of the escape was a nightmare blur of pain and determination. Her body was failing, operating purely on willpower. Several times she nearly passed out from exhaustion and toxic fumes. But she kept moving, driven by survival instinct and the knowledge that capture would mean torture and execution. She emerged from the canal on the Soviet side of the lines nearly 12 hours after entering it. More dead than alive. Soldiers who found her barely recognized her as human. She was so covered in filth and industrial waste. They carried her to medical facilities where doctors worked for hours to treat chemical burns, dehydration, and numerous injuries. But the mission was complete. Intelligence confirmed that while General Richter had survived the initial wound, he died during surgery to remove the bullet. All three generals were dead, eliminated by a single sniper who had achieved what an entire army could not. The bounty on her head had been enormous. The resources devoted to stopping her had been immense. But she had completed her mission despite everything the German military could do to prevent it. News of the third assassination spread rapidly through both armies. For Soviet forces, it was a tremendous morale boost, proof that no enemy was beyond reach, that determination and skill could overcome any odds. For German forces, it was a terrifying demonstration that even their highest-ranking officers were vulnerable, that nowhere was truly safe, that this female sniper was something beyond normal human capabilities. Lyudmila refused to leave the front lines. Despite her injuries, despite the recommendations of doctors and the concerns of her commanders, she insisted on returning to duty as soon as she could hold a rifle again. The war was not over. Her country was still under attack. As long as she could fight, she would fight. It was that simple in her mind, but something had changed. The missions against the three generals had pushed her beyond normal limits, had required her to become something more than a soldier, more than a sniper. She had become a weapon, a tool of war, and the transformation had cost her something essential. The woman who had volunteered out of patriotic duty was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, more efficient, but less human. Her fellow soldiers noticed the change. The Lyudmila who returned to combat was quieter, more isolated, spending hours alone when not on missions. She no longer joined in the rare moments of celebration or camaraderie. She simply existed between missions, waiting for the next target, the next shot, the next kill. In March 1943, during heavy fighting near Sevastopol, Lyudmila was hit by mortar shrapnel while moving between positions. The wounds were not immediately life-threatening, but they were severe enough that her commanders finally had the authority to remove her from frontline combat against her wishes. She was evacuated to a hospital in the rear, where doctors worked to repair the damage. While she recovered, Soviet leadership made a decision. Lyudmila's value as a symbol and propaganda tool had become greater than her value as a combat soldier. She had confirmed 309 kills, the highest total of any Soviet sniper at that point in the war. Her story of eliminating 3 enemy generals had made her famous not just in the Soviet Union, but internationally. She could serve her country better through different means. She was sent on a diplomatic tour, first to other parts of the Soviet Union to boost morale, then to allied countries including the United States. The tour was surreal for someone who had spent months living in ruins, crawling through sewers, existing on the edge of survival. Suddenly she was attending formal dinners, meeting with presidents and prime ministers, being celebrated as a hero by people who had no concept of what war truly meant. In America, she met with President Franklin Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She spoke at rallies, gave speeches about the war, tried to communicate the reality of what Soviet people were experiencing. American audiences were fascinated by this young woman who had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers, who had taken out 3 generals through impossible missions, who represented both the horror of war and the strength of the human spirit. But Lyudmila struggled with her role as a symbol. She was being used to tell a story, to inspire others, to serve political purposes. The reality of her experiences, the weight of the lives she had taken, the psychological cost of her missions, all of this was simplified into heroic narratives that felt false to her. She had not fought for glory or recognition. She had fought because there was no choice, because her country was being destroyed, because someone had to stand against the invasion. The tour kept her away from combat for months. By the time she returned to the Soviet Union, the situation at Sevastopol had deteriorated further. The city was on the verge of falling completely to German forces. Her old comrades were dead or missing. The positions she had defended were overrun, the front lines had collapsed. She had been away being celebrated while the people she had fought alongside were dying. Soviet leadership would not allow her to return to combat. She was too valuable as a propaganda asset, too famous to risk losing in battle. Instead, she was assigned to train other snipers, to pass on her knowledge and skills to a new generation of soldiers who would continue the fight. It was important work, necessary work, but it felt like exile to her. She threw herself into training with the same intensity she had brought to combat. The students she trained learned not just about shooting and tactics, but about patience, about reading battlefields, about the psychological warfare that was as important as marksmanship. Many of these students would go on to become successful snipers themselves, carrying forward her methods and her legacy. But training others meant reliving her own experiences repeatedly. Each lesson forced her to remember specific kills, specific missions, specific moments when she had made life or death decisions. The psychological toll mounted. She began having nightmares, seeing the faces of men she had killed, questioning decisions she had made during the heat of combat. After the war ended in 1945, Lyudmila tried to return to normal life. She completed her university education, earned her degree in history as she had originally planned before the war interrupted everything. She worked as a historian and researcher, trying to find peace in academic pursuits, trying to become again the person she had been before the war transformed her. But the past never truly released its grip. She was constantly reminded of her war service, asked to speak at events, requested to tell her story repeatedly. The Soviet government used her as an example of Soviet heroism, trotting her out whenever they needed a symbol of wartime sacrifice and victory. She complied because she understood the political necessity, but each appearance felt like reopening old wounds. The psychological damage from her service became more apparent as years passed. What today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder was simply called shell shock, or ignored entirely. Veterans were expected to move on, to be grateful for survival, to not burden others with their experiences. Lyudmila suffered in relative silence, maintaining a public image of strength while privately struggling with memories and nightmares. She married twice, both marriages ending in divorce. The war had changed her in ways that made normal relationships difficult. How could she explain to a spouse what it felt like to take a human life through a rifle scope? How could she share the experience of crawling through toxic sewers to assassinate an enemy general? The distance between her wartime self and her peacetime existence created gaps that could not be bridged. In her later years, Lyudmila became more willing to speak honestly about her experiences. She wrote about the reality of war, not the sanitized version presented in propaganda, but the actual cost in human terms. She described the psychological burden of killing, the impossibility of ever being the same person after experiencing such things, the way war destroyed not just bodies but souls. She also spoke about the 3 generals she had eliminated, missions that had defined her career and haunted her conscience. She never expressed regret for the actions themselves, believing they were necessary to end the war sooner and save Soviet lives, but she acknowledged the moral weight of targeted assassination. The difference between battlefield combat and planned killing, the way those missions had changed her fundamentally. Younger veterans sought her out, looking for understanding from someone who had experienced similar things. She became a mentor to those struggling with their own wartime traumas, offering not comfort, but honesty, not easy answers, but shared understanding. She told them what no one had told her, that surviving war meant carrying it with you forever, that the goal was not to forget but to learn to live despite remembering. The bounty that Germans had placed on her head, the reward that had attracted elite snipers and hunters, had never been claimed. She had survived every attempt to kill her, had outlasted the army that wanted her dead, had lived to see the defeat of the forces that invaded her country. In that sense, she had won. But victory felt hollow when she considered the cost, both to herself and to the countless others who had died during those terrible years. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974 at the age of 58, her health damaged by wartime injuries and toxic exposure. She was buried with full military honors, recognized as a hero of the Soviet Union, celebrated for achievements that she had long since stopped celebrating herself. The woman who had been called Lady Death, who had eliminated 309 enemy soldiers including 3 generals, who had survived impossible missions and insurmountable odds, finally found peace. Her legacy extended far beyond the numbers and the propaganda. She had proven that women could serve in combat roles as effectively as men, breaking barriers and challenging assumptions that had existed for centuries. The female snipers who followed her both during and after the war walked a path she had helped create through determination and skill. But perhaps her most important legacy was her honesty about war. In her writings and speeches, she refused to glorify combat or pretend that killing was anything but terrible, even when necessary. She spoke about the cost of violence, the weight of taking human life, the impossibility of emerging from war unchanged. She forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about what nations ask of their soldiers, about what warfare does to human beings, about the price of survival. The 3 German generals she eliminated, men whose names were recorded in history alongside hers, became symbols of her extraordinary capabilities, but they were also reminders of the moral complexities of warfare, of how individual actions could influence large-scale conflicts, of how one person's determination could change the course of battles and affect the lives of thousands. Military historians still study her tactics, her methods, her approach to impossible missions, her infiltration of enemy territory to reach targets.